The Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, International Terrorism will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. We have also been joined, I believe, I don't see, we may be joined by Representative Omar, member of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, and I ask unanimous consent that she be permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Hearing no objection, Ms. Omar, thank you for being with us for this hearing. I note that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we're holding a hearing on the political, economic, and human rights situation in Egypt. Today, the subcommittee will hear from 2 panels of witnesses, and I know the number of members are facing scheduling constraints, so Ranking Member Wilson and I will hold our full opening statements for the start of the second panel. We have witnessed an unfortunate and troubling trend of human rights abuses in Egypt, from a persecution of political opponents and human rights defenders to politically motivated arrests of Americans, crackdowns on civil society and journalists, to attacks on LGBT activists, religious minorities, as well as gender-based violence. Many of us have raised these concerns publicly and privately with both the Egyptian government and with the United States State Department. Stability and security in Egypt is in our national interest, and I fear that the continued closing of human rights space can cause greater instability. I know that many members of the subcommittee have been increasingly concerned about the state of human rights in Egypt, and our intention today is to shed light on the personal stories of those who have faced the highest levels of government persecution. I want to take a moment to recognize the work that Congressman Connolly has done on behalf of one of our witnesses today, his constituent, Mohamed Soltan. Mr. Connolly has been a vocal defender of human rights in Egypt. He unfortunately has a conflict today related to his oversight work of the Postal Service, but I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record his letter dated September 3rd to the Secretary of State related to Mr. Soltan's ongoing case and the department's decision to certify diplomatic immunity for former Egyptian Prime Minister Bibilawi without objection. As I mentioned, I'll give my full remarks before the start of the second panel, and after recognizing Mr. Wilson, now we will move to witness testimony. And I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. I'll yield to my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for any opening comments he may have.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. I look forward to participating. And as you indicated, we'll be making opening statements prior to the second panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'll now introduce our first panel of distinguished witnesses. Mr. Bahey Hassan is one of the founders of the Egyptian human rights movement in the 1980s. In 2014, he moved to France after receiving death threats for his human rights work. Due to his public criticism of the human rights situation in Egypt, Egyptian courts froze his assets and sentenced him to a total of 18 years in prison. Hassan is a journalist, author, lecturer, and the director of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. I want to note that just last week, Mr. Hassan was sentenced in absentia to 15 years for tweets critical of the judiciary, a sentence widely decried by the international community. Next, Mr. Mohamed Soltan is policy advocate and former political prisoner in Egypt who was imprisoned and tortured after protesting Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's rise to power in 2013. Since his release in May 2015 and return to the United States, Soltan has built on the broad campaign that secured his liberty by co-founding the Freedom Initiative, a leading human rights organization dedicated to the release of political prisoners in the Middle East. Soltan graduated from the Ohio State University with a BS in economics and is currently a graduate student at Georgetown University. I want to thank you both for being here today. We know that speaking out for yourselves and for others has come at great personal cost, and we are extremely grateful that you decided to appear here today with us. Mr. Hassan, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Viva, are we having? All right, I think, Mr. Hassan, I think you might need to unmute. Can we do that for him?
Yeah, by myself.
Okay,
Okay.
terrific.
How you hear me?
Yes,
Do you
yes,
hear me
indeed.
now?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me here to give my personal testimony on human rights situation in Egypt. Please allow me to consider this hearing as a form of dialogue over human rights with the Egyptian government also. Unfortunately, the only channels of dialogue President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi allows with human rights defenders is kidnapping their sons or daughters, such as the case with Aida Saif al-Dawla, or through arresting their spouses, as was the case with Mohamed Lutfi, or through physical assault in public, as was the case with Gamal Eid, or forcibly disappearing and torturing them, as was the case with Ibrahim Azzeddin. In other cases, human rights defenders were kidnapped from the airport while traveling to meet with United Nations experts in Geneva, as was the case with Ibrahim Metwalli. Mohammed al-Baqir, a human rights lawyer, was arrested while attending the interrogation with his client, Ala Abdel Fattah. Another case is Mahinur al-Masri, who was kidnapped in broad daylight and night in front of the prosecutor office. Perhaps those examples explain why the Egyptian parliament selected former police officer accused of torture as the head of its Human Rights Committee, where his time is spent at accusing human rights defenders of being foreign agents. What happened to me was just another form of President Sisi government dialogue with human rights defenders. I was forced to leave Egypt after receiving this threat. I don't know if I will ever be able to go back home. But still, I consider myself lucky compared to tens of thousands of Egyptians who peacefully expressed their opinions and they were killed, jailed, or forcibly disappeared in return. Many died in jail under torture or due to intentional medical negligence, as was the case with former President Mohamed Morsi, the first elected president since the military coup of 1952. Many of those in jail are there after being sentenced in politicized sham trials. Others are spending years and months under fabricated charges without trial. Tens of millions continue to live in the Republic of Fear. When I first received the death threat 3 weeks after President Sisi formally assumed power in June 2014, I was calm. What was surprising was the degree of confidence reflected by those who I consulted that the threat to my life is real and timely. Some of those I consulted were Egypt-based diplomats and the senior United Nations officials in New York and Geneva. After I left Egypt, public figures affiliated with the government incited to kill me on live Egyptian television. One of them, member of the parliament, and is closely affiliated with President Sisi. Another called for attacking me with the same nerve agent used against a Russian citizen in the United Kingdom. He accused me of espionage because I speak out on human rights violations with officials from United Nations and its member states. When I filed a complaint with the Egyptian public prosecutor concerning the televised threat to kill me, it was shelved, and the person who made the threat was later appointed or rewarded, in fact, by President Sisi at a government post tasked with monitoring the professionalism of international media in Egypt. In the years after my death threat, an Egyptian court ordered the freezing of my assets and those of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, along with other human rights organizations and defenders. The same public prosecutor who shelved my complaint against incitement to murder opened two parallel investigations into my public statement on the human rights situation. Just within the past 11 months, I have been sentenced to 18 years in prison for insulting the judiciary and spreading fake news. The moment I found out about my sentence, I remembered Dr. Mustafa Nagar. Nagar was one of the icons of the liberal youth movement of the January 2011 revolution. He won his parliamentary seat in 2011 through a landslide victory against his Muslim Brotherhood-backed opponent. Despite that he legally enjoyed immunity for his statements as a parliamentarian, but in 2017 he was sentenced to 3 years in jail for the same reason I was. But al-Nagar, like thousands of Egyptians over the past few years, was disappeared. Till today, his fate remains unknown. Throughout the past 7 years, many pro-democracy activists were prosecuted and or sentenced in sham trials for allegedly joining an armed terrorist organization. Despite the numerous attempts of those accused to know which terrorist organizations they are accused of joining, the prosecution refuses to inform them and renew their detention anyway. Those accused include renowned Christians and the secular figures, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and even medical staff that criticized the handling of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, the collapse of judicial norms does not only reflect in political cases, but also on the blatant discrimination against women in social cases. Recently, highly publicized cases of rape saw the imprisonment of the victims and the witnesses. It is my criticism of this pattern of fabrication of charges and the politicized trials that earned me the charge of insulting the judiciary. As a matter of fact, for many years, independent human rights defenders, including myself, struggled along with judges for the independence of the judiciary. I never meant to insult the judiciary, but I criticize those who transformed the oldest modern judiciary in the Arab world into a weapon against peaceful dissidents.
Mr.
So
Hassan,
when the judiciary,
Mr. Hassan, if I could,
yes,
if I could ask you to wrap up, please. We're grateful for your testimony. Members, I know, have lots of questions.
okay, I will conclude. I just Mr. Chairman, given this context, I think it is time for serious and transparent talk between the American and the Egyptian governments under the oversight of the Egyptian people and the American taxpayers to partnership between the US and Egypt and the massive gap between its declared goals and
Oh, Mr. Hassan, thank you very much.
myself, for myself, I always saw you guys according to job. Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hassan. We appreciate your being with us. Mr. Sultan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, esteemed members of Congress, I'd like to thank you all for the responsiveness to the urgent calls for a hearing to address unprecedented human rights violations committed by the Egyptian regime against its own citizens. I'm before you today, knowing that the last hearing I testified before Congress, my dad was disappeared in prison for 38 days, beaten and tortured. Prison guards beat my father so badly for what they referred to as my treachery in Congress, that they broke his jaw and teeth. Today, I am here with yet another testimony, as it has been 87 long days since my dad's whereabouts were last known. I testify before you today as 5 of my cousins are held hostage in the same prison I was in 5 years ago. Their ransom is my silence. So I thank you in advance for affording me your undivided attention, because the price of this testimony is steep and the consequences are real. My name is Mohamed Soltan. I'm a 32-year-old Egyptian American. I grew up in the West. I graduated from The Ohio State University, and I'm a die-hard Buckeye fan. And I'm a master's candidate at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. In 2013, I was shot by the Egyptian authorities for live tweeting the violent dispersal of peaceful protests. I was arrested, tortured, sentenced to life in prison on trumped-up charges, and spent 22 months in overcrowded dungeons in the most inhumane conditions imaginable. I still have the cigarette burn scars on the back of my neck. And to this day, I frantically wake up to the sound of shaking keys or slamming doors. My release in 2015 was a result of a global campaign and bipartisan pressure by this body and the US administration. I came home not simply because I'm an American, but because of you. My government demanded it. Some of you in this room were at the forefront of that fight for my life, so I am literally a living testament of the leverage and influence you have to do good. Since my release, I wasted no time joining the fight for good. I have had way too many terrible coffees in Longworth and Dirks in cafeterias. With many of your staff, I have working on 60,000 political prisoners, including fellow American citizens. We work together across party lines with successive administrations to save innocent lives and secure their freedom. Earlier this summer, I filed a lawsuit under the Torture Victim Protection Act against the former Egyptian Prime Minister and current IMF Executive Director. As Prime Minister, he ordered the mass killings of protesters. He ordered my arrest, torture, and attempted extrajudicial killing. Biblawi also ratified the draconian protest law, which has given the military regime the legal pretext to crack down on, arrest, and charge thousands of critics, including American citizens. One of them, Mustafa Qasim, who died earlier this year in prison for no reason at all, while his torturer hoped to live out the rest of his life in this country miles away from here, enjoying the democracy and freedoms he deprived Egyptians of. In a brazen attempt to deter my pursuit of justice, the Egyptian regime arrested 5 of my apolitical cousins and took my father, a green card holder, to an undisclosed location days after the complaint was filed. Simultaneously, the regime demanded that the State Department grant diplomatic immunity or risk the bilateral relationship. The Egyptian regime used hostage-taking to interfere in our legal process, all while bullying the US administration into providing them with the necessary cover. So how exactly did we get here? How can a ruthless regime we subsidize with over $1.3 billion of our tax dollars every single year assault our judiciary, breach our sovereignty without any repercussions? How can they be hailed as an ally or a partner while becoming increasingly resistant to pressure about its dismal human rights record? This didn't happen in a vacuum. It's no secret that Egypt under Sisi has become a black hole for human rights, democratic governance, and rule of law. This ruthless regime has not been held accountable for a single crime or violation they committed since. The simple answer is impunity. Toothless diplomacy in the face of bully diplomacy and state thuggery. And my story is emblematic of this toxic one-way relationship the US has with Egypt. In the same week that the Egyptian regime was granted a certificate of immunity for my torture, the State Department also signed a national security waiver to release the $300 million in aid, foregoing the leverage given to them by this body to advance human rights mere months after an American citizen died in Egyptian prison. The very next week, Egyptians thumbed its nose at the US by gloating about the Su-35 fighter jets they were warned by both the Department of State and the Department of Defense against acquiring. And so something has to change, and it starts right here, right now. I'm honored and privileged to be here to tell my story and the story of tens of thousands living in constant state of crippling fear. And my being here today will be for nothing if you do nothing. And so as a former political prisoner whose freedom this body championed, as a human rights defender who has vowed to make freedom the fight of his life, as an Egyptian whose only dream was to enjoy the same liberties and freedoms I enjoy as an American, and as a son who doesn't know if he'll ever get to have another heated argument with this old man, I implore you to use the 3 C's he taught me when dealing with bullies: courage, consequence, consistency. May you have the moral and political courage to take action and place real consequences for the grave violations of human rights and rule of law, and the consistency in policies that advance our values and our interests. My testimony on the record will have more concrete asks, and I'm sure my respected colleagues will have specific recommendations for you. But I have one thing: your words matter, your actions matter, your signatures matter, your resolutions matter, your bills matter, and your sanctions matter. So I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Soltan and Mr. Hassan, for your powerful testimony. We appreciate you joining us for this hearing today and providing your very important and personal perspective to help frame our discussion. I'll now recognize any members who wish to ask questions of our first panel for for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know. We'll circle back to you. And if you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will yield my time initially to my colleague from New Jersey, the champion of human rights, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing. I think we were all very, very moved just now by Mr. Soltan's statement. We have before us two lifelong courageous champions of human rights in Egypt. But I have to say, for me, this hearing is not fundamentally about human rights in Egypt. It's not about how Egypt treats its own citizens. It's about how the government of Egypt treats Americans. It's about how the government of Egypt treats us. That's what we have to reckon with. That's what we have to wrestle with as we continue to fund the Egyptian military to the tune of $1.3 billion a year. What Mr. Soltan went through in an Egyptian prison was absolutely atrocious. He has the absolute right as an American citizen to avail himself of our courts, to seek justice, to seek restitution for what he suffered. The Egyptian government has an absolute right to defend itself. I disagree with them, but they have a right to defend themselves in our courts. What they do not have is the right to kidnap the family members of an American citizen to try to interfere with that judicial proceeding. The question I want to ask you to begin with, Mr. Soltan, is what happened to you, it is what is happening to you right now, unique, or is this, in your view, part of a pattern in terms of how the Egyptian government treats American citizens, whether they are in Egypt or on our soil, the way that they are threatening and intimidating you to drop this case?
Thank you very much, Congressman. The simple answer is definitely not. The Egyptian government has a long history of reaching outside its borders to intimidate any critics and their families, including Egyptians and Americans. 2 days ago, the brother of a prominent anchor and journalist in Turkey died in prison, and he was held hostage. The brother of Reem Dessouky, the American citizen, is still in prison until today because he advocated for his sister. She got picked up from Cairo airport for Facebook posts. You have my own father in 2015, when I testified before this Congress, there was retribution against him. There is a long history of this. What's so funny is the escalation that happened in this last summer with my family, the ripple effect of it, and the Egyptians knew exactly what they were doing. I had a prominent friend who ran for high office last election, who is of Egyptian origin, call me and tell me how scared he is that if one day he becomes a public official, what he will be he'll be up against if he is critical of the Egyptian government.
Sorry to interrupt. This is an Egyptian American who ran for office in the United States.
In the United States, yes. Right. And so there is a pattern of behavior, and the Egyptian regime continues to sort of push the envelope and just test our limits. And so long as we remain silent, so long as there is no price, no cost for the sort of escalating repression, we don't know what will happen next. If they feel emboldened to assault our judiciary in the way that they did, what happens if they threaten people here on, and they have in the past. In the last Egypt Advocacy Day in 2019, they hacked right here in Washington, D.C., they hacked our websites and came and took pictures of Egyptian Americans that came to lobby Congress on human rights. And so long as there's no real consequences, they will continue escalating in their repression and reaching deep into our borders. And that's not okay.
So it's not okay, and it should be enough for us to reflect on that aid package. But you know what? There's also U.S. law. And let me just finish my time by reminding not the chairman, but the Egyptian government officials who are tuning in right now, that the U.S. law, the Arms Export Control Act, is very, very clear on this. It said that we cannot issue export licenses for military sales to any government in the world that is determined by the president, and I'm reading from the law, to be engaged in a consistent pattern of acts of intimidation or harassment directed against individuals in the United States. That is the law. And in the NDAA, the National Defense Bill that the House just passed, we cited that provision, and we've asked the administration to determine whether, in fact, Egypt is engaged in such a pattern. I don't think there's any question that the answer is yes, and if yes, the consequence will be no more military sales. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Ranking Member Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Soltan, I sympathize for the situation that you're in, but during the Muslim Brotherhood-led protests that followed Mohamed Morsi's ouster in 2013, U.S. designated terrorists were featured as speakers, and speeches included hate-filled comments against Jews and Christians. More to the point of the hearing, Amnesty International documented that Morsi's supporters tortured people at these protests. Media reports indicate that you are a media spokesman for these Muslim Brotherhood-led protests. Is that true?
No, absolutely not. I'm a human rights defender, and those are absolutely false claims.
Well, actually, it should be known that if you claim that you were not a Muslim Brotherhood spokesman in the past, Time Magazine, even the Washington Post, and other outlets refer to you as a spokesperson. Additionally, copies of your deleted tweets in which you celebrated Hamas attacks against the innocent people of Israel, as well as mourning the death of the notorious al-Qaeda recruiter Anwar al-Awlaki. Why did you delete these tweets? Mr. Chairman, I can't hear.
Well, can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, yeah, I'll read off what 18 different human rights organizations have said, that this is, all of these things are coordinated, a campaign of harassment against me, and as part of a broader repression of rights and freedoms in Egypt, is aimed to stigmatize human rights defenders, both nationally and abroad, and undermine the effectiveness of their work. So no, sir, those are not. I was arrested for tweeting the violent dispersal, which Human Rights Watch called the worst mass murder of protests in a single day. I'm not here to answer ideological or political questions. My record is known to everybody, and those are the exact. I'm sorry that you've been sort of privy to a misinformation campaign that the Egyptian regime has systemically practiced against me for this exact reason. And I'm happy to meet you one-on-one and discuss all of these things so you can know what my views are on a number of issues. They're public, and you can. My Twitter is available for anyone to go and look at.
And indeed, I am concerned and saddened that you would have tweets that celebrate Hamas with their attacks against innocent Israeli citizens, and then in any way praising al-Qaeda. And finally, I have a statement, and then I want to ask a question of Mr. Hassan. I believe it's out of place to have a Muslim Brotherhood official who publicly praised terrorists testify before Congress as a human rights activist. There are plenty of legitimate human rights activists in Egypt without these kinds of concerning links to terrorism. I'd look forward, Mr. Chairman, to hearing from them in the future. And so for Mr. Hassan, can you please describe trends of human rights in Egypt over the last 5 years?
Mr. Hassan, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am. Do you
Yep. Now we hear you.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Please, would you please repeat your question? Last question.
Well, the question is, what is the status of human rights for the people of Egypt in the last 5 years?
Yeah, the situation of human rights in Egypt in the last 5, or I would say 7 years, is the worst in modern history of Egypt. As I explained in my testimony, that torture, involuntary disappearance, arbitrary detention,
Yes.
there are tens of thousands of Egyptian people who suffered such pattern of human rights abuses. In addition to that, there are many peaceful, innocent Egyptians were arbitrarily killed because just they expressed their views peacefully. In the course of counter-terrorism, which is a concern also for human rights organizations, course of counter-terrorism, there are also a lot of innocent people, whatever Egyptian, whatever in Sinai or in other cities, were also killed in this in the fight against. In additional, I would say, unfortunately, Egypt, Egypt had the first newspaper 2 centuries ago. Now, there is no, in fact, single independent Egyptian newspaper or single independent TV channel. We political parties, the first political party in Egypt was founded more than 150 years ago. Now we have more than 100 political parties, but most of them are windows for the security bodies, and the rest are ineffective because they have to freeze formally or informally their activities because of the escalation of repression against peaceful activism. I am talking about
Thank you.
victimized political parties.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan. Thank you, Mr. Hassan. Mr. Wilson, your time's expired.
I yield back.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Mr. Cicilline, I would just note for my friend that Mr. Soltan is here as an American citizen who was tortured and imprisoned by an ally of the United States, and whether we agree ideologically or disagree vehemently, I think that we can all agree that torture is never justified. I'll go to Mr. Cicilline next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this really important hearing. And thank you to Mr. Hassan and Mr. Soltan for your bravery and your courage in coming forward to share your testimony. Mr. Sultan, my first question is for you. As we think about what Congress can do in response to these serious violations of human rights, obviously we've appropriated over the last 4 years $5.2 billion. In addition to that, the International Monetary Fund has loaned Egypt $17 billion. And so the first question I have is, is your suggestion, your recommendation that we simply stop providing that kind of military assistance? And if so, do you have a sense of what impact that might have on the stability of the regime? And maybe that's it being unstable is a good thing. I don't know, but what's your assessment of what U.S. Withdrawal of military aid until the behavior of the regime changes on the issue of human rights? What would the impact be? I think you're still on mute, Mr. Sultan.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So I think that there is, we have worked with this administration, with both the Trump administration and with the Obama administration on getting wins, on getting American citizens and Egyptian citizens freed that are in terrible, terrible situations, people that were enforcedly disappeared, tortured in prison. My respected colleagues will have, I think, more concrete recommendations for you. But right away, you said we give $1.3 billion. I don't believe that we should cut off aid because that will hurt the Egyptian people. I think that we should condition the aid. There's leverage that Congress gives successive administrations, $300 million to advance human rights in Egypt, and we have signed the national security waiver. One thing could be to remove the national security waiver until their human rights situation gets better. There are other tools. There's the Magnitsky sanctions. Senator Cardin and Senator McCain, God rest his soul, submitted Magnitsky sanctions using my case of torture because it was so well documented by international human rights organizations. And the administration tabled it. So trying to exhaust the already ready tools and leverage that we have at our disposal, recognizing first that a lot of people just throw their hands up and say, well, we don't know how to deal with the Egyptians. They're bullies. And with bullies, you don't ask for less, you ask for more. And so we have toothless diplomacy. Yes, letters are good, tweets are good, but actually taking some real steps of holding them accountable for the tens of thousands of peoples across the political and ideological spectrum. When an American citizen flies from IAD into Cairo airport and gets picked up, gets separated from her child, this Pennsylvania one, Reem Dasuki, for Facebook posts, that's not okay. That's not okay. And so there are already tools. The IMF didn't just give 17, they gave $12 billion from May until today. In 4 months, $12 billion that they gave the Egyptian government. These are our tax dollars. What are we doing with them? Something has to change. And so the tools that already exist at this body's disposal and trying to utilize them in creative ways, we can, but recognizing, changing the posture of realizing that we need to do something different first. Then finding the tools are there. We just haven't had the will to use them.
Thank you. And then final question, would you just describe a little bit more about your experience in prison and then also the detention or arrest of your 5 cousins and the whereabouts of your father, and just give us a little more context for that.
I mean, the Egyptian prisons are the most notorious prisons that, historically. They are, we have, in the last 7 or 8 months, we've had over 23 deaths, including an American citizen, with the COVID situation. It's truly an inhumane place. I wouldn't want animals living there, let alone human beings. And you have, again, 60,000 political prisoners, people that literally journalists, activists, critics, political dissidents that are in these places with completely forgotten. completely beaten and using some, pretext of ideological differences or whatever ridiculousness is being spewed out there. But you have, Ziad al-Alaimi, as Bahey mentioned, Ziad al-Alaimi is a liberal, secular, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, parliament member like yourself, who's in prison today because because of a hope case, because he wanted to build a political coalition in parliament. And so the continued sort of emboldening of this military regime to throw everybody. He threw the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was an American ally, Sami Anan, in prison. He put the former prime minister on house arrest. This man has no limits. This military regime is so vicious, so ruthless. It doesn't see color. It only sees literally the gun and the bullet. And so something has to be done. Something has to be done.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr.
Soltan.
Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Connolly, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Mohamed, I'm so glad you're with us today, and thank you for being so outspoken in the best sense of the word in bringing sunlight and scrutiny to the human rights record of the current Egyptian government. I'm sorry to join you late. I had a seminar I was giving for Cornell University, and I just got off. So forgive me if this might overlap with previous questions, but I'd be interested, Mohamed, in you. I heard you say cutting off aid hurts the Egyptian people. And I also thought I heard you say, but we could use other levers like the international banks in terms of lending to the Egyptian government and maybe withholding that or conditioning that. But my concern is that the free flow of both economic and military aid to the Egyptian government also sends a signal, however, to the LCC government that they can continue to operate with impunity. And I wonder if you can comment on that. What other measures would you commend to, say, the U.S. Congress to try to circumscribe the behavior of this administration and insist on adherence to international norms with respect to human rights and the rights of Egyptian and dual citizens?
Hi. I think just using the leverage that already exists. Don't use the exceptions. The national security waiver is a huge one, and we can use it, and we continuously don't. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have signed the national security waiver, and this is an issue. There's already leverage that we already have. The military aid, the $1.3 billion, the $300 million of the national security waiver is there in place. Let's just use it. The Magnitsky sanctions, some visa bans on human rights torturers. The guy that literally signed the draconian protest law should not be living out in McLean and has a penthouse in Watergate. He should not. This guy's responsible for the death of an American citizen. He's responsible for the tens of thousands. These are 60 political prisoners out of 60,000 political prisoners from all across the political and ideological spectrum right here behind me. These people, he ratified the law that caused their arrest and their agony and their torture. And this man wants to live out the rest of his life under the rule of law and and democracy after he denied so many Egyptians of it. There's already the Torture Victim Protection Act needs an amendment so that there isn't a legal loophole where people like that can make use of it. We have so many tools at our disposal. We just have to use them. And if we need new legislation, let's amend some of these laws. The Arms Export Act that Congressman Tom Malinowski used. Let's see what the trends are in what's it called? An intimidation of American citizens. I was approached right here in Tyson's Corner in your district when I was buying an iPhone in the Apple store by an Egyptian intelligence who flashed a fake badge, flashed a fake Interpol badge. And I reported this to the FBI. How can American citizens, people that are calling for freedoms and human rights, literally, you don't have to look over their shoulder. Mohamed Amasha, who was released, who many of you called for his release, who was released and was sent back to New Jersey last month by US administration pushing for it and Congress. He should be speaking to you today, but he's scared. Just like so many other Egyptians and Egyptian Americans that are scared to hell that their families are going to face the same fate my family is. And that's not okay. And so the willingness, again, I want to leave it up to the experts that will come after me, and they are damn good, to give you concrete recommendations, very feasible ones on what to do, and I will submit it on the record. But let's just use the existing leverage that we have. Thank you.
And thank you for your courage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Trone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you for holding this hearing. And I just had one question for Mr. Soltan. You recently filed suit, in district court against a former interim prime minister of Egypt. And if you're successful, what remedy will that bring for the abuses that you suffered?
Thank you so much, Congressman. We'll wait until the judge sort of rules on that. I don't know, but what I do know is that it was the only avenue for me, the only peaceful legal avenue for me to try and pursue justice and accountability for crimes that were committed against me, for the violations that happened against me. It was the only avenue that I had, and I took it. And it cost me so much. It cost me 5 of my cousins, apolitical cousins, who have not been bothered in the last 5 years since I've been released, in the last 7 years since Sisi's been there, and were literally kidnapped from their homes in the middle of the night because I filed this lawsuit, because there hasn't been a single act of accountability against all of the crimes that have been done against Egyptians and Americans. And so I don't know. It's a civil lawsuit, and so whatever the judge wants to afford me, but I that's not what I'm looking for. I just want closure. I just want closure. That's all.
And I think regardless of the outcome, what opportunities do you see that this case will present to really draw attention? And that's what we need to have to this mistreatment of dissidents that's been ongoing, that you and your family have been subjected to.
Mr. Sultan, if you could unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I think deterrence. Deterrence is the main word here. I think so that every official, high or low official in the Egyptian government, can think twice before obeying orders. In 2014, there was a video that was leaked of then General Sisi telling his officers, shoot, nobody will be held accountable. And up until I filed that lawsuit, that has been the law governing Egypt. And so deterrence is the goal here, so that we can make sure that the crimes that were committed against me don't happen again to other people, or at least they'll have second thoughts about it. I remember sharing with Senator McCain's office a video from prison when he submitted my case for Magnitsky sanctions that ended up getting tabled. And I can't tell you the happiness inside from prisoners celebrating, because those were the same people that were still torturing them at that time. They were so happy because of the ripple effect that it had all the way in Egyptian dungeons, where small officers were thinking, oh, wow, can we be added to those lists? please don't report us. And so deterrence is key. And so to make sure that no crime goes unanswered, that no crime doesn't have a price. And also it really, really helps with, I remember when I was in prison and hearing the US administration, then a Democratic administration, saying something, but then hearing Senator McCain speak up and Senator Graham and others speaking up. Today, Senator Rubio and others, Senator Sullivan, people, Congressman McCall, yourself and others, Smith, and so many others that have been so outspoken about these issues. Our values are a bipartisan issue. And they have been and they will continue to be. And so we want to make sure that we need to do what we need to do to make sure we're advancing both those values and interests. And they're not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely. Mr. Soltan, thank you for your courage and your testimony here today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. Representative Green, first of all, welcome to the committee. It's good to have you with us. And I don't know whether you would like to ask questions or not, but it would be your turn. So I will ask you.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be a part of this subcommittee, and I greatly appreciate the witnesses that are here today and the discussion. Having been to the Middle East many, many different times, both with our military and as, I guess, a tourist and learner, it is an amazing place. It is really the birthplace of so many of our civilizations. And to think that these injustices that have been described are continuing, I mean, I agree with Marco Rubio. It warrants our full attention. It warrants our immediate action. I don't really have any prepared comments for today, Mr. Chairman. I just appreciate your leadership on the committee and for the opportunity to be here and to listen in. And I apologize for my tardy arrival. I was on the select committee for the coronavirus, so I just left there.
Thank you, Representative Green. No need to apologize. Lots of important work to do. We're really glad to have you with us and appreciate your participation. Next, we will go to Representative Sherman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Soltan. Thank you for your courage. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important hearing. For decades, Egypt has been among the top 3 recipients of aid from the United States, mostly military aid. This was agreed as part of the, or in conjunction with the settlement with Israel. But it's been decades since that settlement. Other countries have reached a settlement, and it's not like Egypt didn't get anything out of that settlement with Israel. They got the return of the Sinai, which is, I believe, the largest piece of territory returned from a country that won a war to a country that lost a war as part of a peace process. I think that's the largest piece of territory that has been turned over under circumstances in the last century. So Egypt has taken for granted that it would be among the top 3 aid recipients, and that the 1.3 in military billion in military aid would simply continue. They've taken it for granted that their human rights record wouldn't hold that money up, because we have an administration that doesn't care about human rights. As others have commented, we know that the Egyptian government is watching, and they should have listened to Mr. Malinowski and remember that he epitomizes the human rights approach taken the last time that Joe Biden was in the White House. And one can certainly not assume that the next administration will be as disinterested in human rights as the current administration. I will point out one thing, and that is the government of President Sisi does not have a sterling human rights record. Neither does its predecessor and still most powerful opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, which engaged in torture and had a horrific record in the treatment of the Coptic minority of Egypt. But you cannot excuse the current government's approach to human rights as compared with its predecessor. In fiscal year 2020, Congress indicated that $300 million of the foreign military financing program should be held up until the State Department certifies that the government of Egypt is taking sustained and effective steps to improve human rights. I believe there was a national security waiver to that required certification, but certainly that enactment begs the question, how can it be said that the Egyptian government has demonstrated to sustain and effective steps toward improving its human rights record? Mr. Hassan, has the Egyptian government met that standard? Mr. Hassan, you may need to unmute. Mr. Hassan? There you are. I think you're unmuted.
Do you hear me?
Now we do.
Okay, please, your question.
I'm at the appropriations bill that we passed, provided that 300 million of the aid would be withheld unless the State Department could certify that the government of Egypt is taking sustained and effective steps to improve human rights. Now, there may have been a provision to allow the administration to escape that standard by declaring that it was critical to America's national security, but the standard is still in the law. Do you think the government of Egypt meets that standard? Has it shown sustained and effective steps to improve human rights in Egypt?
Absolutely no. What the government of Egypt is doing is more and more escalation of repression. This year in particular has witnessed unprecedented level of escalation. We have this government has dealt with the crisis of the COVID-19 as an opportunity rather than risk. So instead of releasing prisoner of conscience or peaceful activists or human rights defenders, more and more were arrested, more and more their detention were extended several times. Even doctors who complained about or criticized the Ministry of Health or the government policies in relation to COVID-19, they were arrested and they still in prison for several months.
I want to squeeze in one more question. And from a world perspective, a number of the enemies of democracy, from Hong Kong to Moscow to Hungary, have used COVID-19 as an excuse to reduce democracy and freedom.
Yeah.
I want to focus on the December arrest of activist Rami Kamel. Rights groups and Coptic advocacy groups here in the United States agree that that arrest is an effort by the Egyptian government to punish and silence him for documenting and publicizing human rights abuses of the Coptic community. Does either of our witnesses know anything about Mr. Kamel's position and whether these false charges are typical of the Egyptian government's behavior?
Mr. Sherman, your time has expired, but we'll let the witnesses go ahead and answer.
Okay.
Mr. Hassan?
Yes, I would say that no surprise in arresting Coptic human rights defenders, but I mean this is there is no exception for repressing Coptic community. But what surprises me is charging some Coptic activists as a terrorist or collaborate with a terrorist organization. So in this context, I think that there is no specific better treatment with the Coptic community.
And I'll just add really quickly. We've been advocating for Rami and others that were imprisoned. During my time in prison in solitary confinement, there was a Coptic that was charged with being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he was in my next door cell. It's sort of a one size fits all allegation, sort of like Mr. Wilson's allegation against me.
That's a good. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, we can.
Well, thank you very much for holding this hearing. Appreciate it very much, and the ranking member. And I also want to thank our witnesses today. As I was listening, I couldn't help but remember that in 2017, I was in Egypt, and I was heading out, I believe, to the North Camp in the Sinai, where you have the peacekeeping observers there at the MFO, and there was dual bombings. I believe there was a bombing in Alexandria of a Coptic church, and there was also a bombing, I think, in Tanta, and a number of people were killed. Sadly, I heard Mass in the Sinai. It was Palm Sunday. But it also, on a previous trip, I had the chance to tour the Coptic Cathedral in Egypt and saw that it had also been attacked. And unfortunately, a number of Coptic Christians had been killed. And the reality is, I think that we've seen human rights abuses, certainly from this regime, but also the prior regimes. I can say that pretty clearly we saw under the Mubarak regime that there were human rights abuses. I don't think that there's any secret about that. And under the Morsi regime, we had also human rights abuses. I don't remember the golden time of a situation where we haven't had any. I do have to say, and I've been to Egypt, I think 5 times or so, that Egyptians, for the most part that I met, have great affinity for Americans, and we were welcomed, and it's been a wonderful experience trying to figure out how to work with Egypt. But the human rights abuses continue. What should we do? I mean, the reality is that there's a lot of poor people in Egypt. I think that we have the responsibility to help, and we're attempting to do that. I mean, Egypt is the largest country in the Middle East there, and I think probably the most important if you look at sustained peace. And so what do we do? I mean, we're kind of caught in a tough position. I mean, what do we do? Obviously, there's sanctions. I mean, I'm very concerned what is going on with the Russians and Russian fighters potentially going to Egypt. But what do we do? I mean, as Americans, as people who are very concerned about human rights of all Egyptians, at the same time concerned about the position that Egypt has and its importance. What should we do as Congress? What should we do as Americans? And I would ask either one of the gentlemen that are here to present.
So if I may, Bahey, Egypt, according to the World Bank, has a population of 100 million. 62 million Egyptians are under the age of 29. So I'm considered a boomer in Egypt. And so the Egyptian, the poverty line and the proportion of Egyptians under the poverty line is increasing day in and day out. And repression continues to increase day in and day out. And as Mr. Bahey said, there is absolutely no comparison between the repression, the levels of repression that we are seeing under Sisi with any other regime in Egypt's modern history. It's unprecedented. Egypt is a pressure cooker with no outlet. And if it implodes, you are right. It will not be, it will pour over to the entire region. And so it is very, very, and so the current regime is not the anchor, it's the antagonist. It's what will make it implode if it continues on this trajectory. And as US Congress, we should let them know that they're heading in a wrong direction.
Mr. Soltan, if I could interrupt you just for 1 second before my time completes. I do remember, though, the end of the Mubarak regime. That is exactly what happened. I mean, you had a pressure cooker, you had the spring, you had things going very badly. So I mean, there is another instance where that happened. Is that not the case?
It's nowhere near. People are reminiscing on the Mubarak days today. The Mubarakites themselves are in house arrests, are in prison. You have Hisham Geneina, who was the head of the head of one of the agencies, the oversight agency, that is in prison today. He was beaten up in broad daylight in Egypt, and so it's unprecedented.
My time is concluded. I just wanted to say thank you for your courage, and I appreciate you very much because you're speaking and what your family has suffered. I'm very sorry for. But again, thank you for your courage to speak up. We're trying to find a solution. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Ms. Omar, you're recognized.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing and for allowing me to join you in your committee. To Mr. Hassan, Mr. Soltan, thank you so much for your courage and for your ability to share your story with us and with the American people. Mr. Soltan, it's really heart-wrenching to listen to you recount your story and the torture that you've experienced and what your family and extended family is going through at the moment. I know you said that you were suing Hassan Bablawi under the Torture Victim Protection Act. And I think as members of Congress, we need to learn from your experience and use it to strengthen this particular law. I'm wondering if you could tell us what role the State Department has played in your case. Do they recognize Mr. Bablawi's diplomatic immunity?
It's a good Freudian slip there. The State Department, I have to give them. We've been working with the State Department. Secretary Pompeo has referenced my case. Assistant Secretary Schenker has raised my case multiple times. There have been tweets. It's simply not enough. To me, again, the Egyptians bully diplomacy with toothless diplomacy is exactly getting us to the place where we are today, where there is a continued downward trajectory of human rights violations in Egypt that needs to stop. And so while I'm very, very grateful for the State Department's role in advocating for my right to pursue justice, it's simply not enough. And for the State Department to also give Hassan Bablawi the certificate of immunity to try to deny me my day in court honestly only strengthens my resolve and conviction that I'm on the right side of issues that it took not one, two states, one using hostage taking and another using a legal loophole to deny me my day in court.
So let me see if I understand. It doesn't sound like the State Department has taken your side as a citizen of this country, but they're taking the side of the Egyptian government and siding with your torturer. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes, they have responded to their demands. It's a lot more complicated. They call it pro forma, but yes, that's the theme. A day after we helped this administration get a win, an American citizen, Mohamed Amasha, released. The very next day, the same guy that ratified the law that got Mohamed Amasha arrested gets immunity. The same week, they get $300 million in aid. So I would say it's, again, as I said in my opening statement, it's a toxic one-way relationship where we're not getting nearly as much as the Egyptian government is.
Mm-hmm. And has that made you aware of weaknesses within this law that we can work to strengthen as members of Congress?
I'm not a lawyer, but I would imagine that there is, and I think the interpretation of the law, and it's currently being litigated in court, and we're hoping to hear from the judge anytime soon. But what we do know is that yes, if this case gets thrown out because of this legal loophole, there needs to be some sort of revisiting of this law that's the only available tool and mechanism that affords victims of torture some sort of remedy.
Yeah.
The sort of the spirit of the law is being stripped from under when we can't actually move over to the actual case, to actual discovery and seeing what happened in the case. And so, yes, definitely, short answer.
Yeah. And I know some of my colleagues have asked this particular question. So let me see if I can ask it in a different way, see if we can maybe get an answer for it. How does CC respond to public shaming? I know that many of us call out his use of torture. We've spoken up about political prisoners, the extrajudiciary killings. Does he care? Is that an effective thing for us to do? Or is there something that we can do with the security aid and that might garner a better response?
Ms. Omar, your time has expired, but we'll go ahead and let the witnesses answer the question.
Thank you, Chairman.
And you're muted, Mr. Soltan.
Bahey, do you want to take this? Okay. I think that there is, I think understanding the way the Egyptians perceive and sort of take in all of this. They see it through their own authoritarian vantage point. And so they see everything as coordinated. And so when there's a hearing, but a few weeks before they got $300 million, they got $12 billion a few months from that, they'll see it as lip service when it's not. They think we're that sort of, that there's some sort of coordination between the different agencies and the different bodies of government when there is not. So understanding that, because they are very good at form picking. So if they don't like something from Congress, they'll go to the State Department. They don't get something from the State Department, they'll go to DOD. And if not, they'll go to the IC. And so understanding for the US government having a cohesive sort of policy towards Egypt. And that's why there needs to be a reevaluation of the entire policy towards Egypt in a way that advances our interests and values, not so that they can take advantage of the loopholes and sort of form pick their way into their own, trajectory of repression. And so I don't think, I think it's complex, and I think there needs to be a carrot and the stick, and it needs to be played in a cohesive way. And so the public shaming works only if there's somebody that's privately, making sure that that we're getting what we want and and we have that influence. But not everybody's playing good cop right now or they're throwing their hands up and saying we don't know what to do.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Before wrapping up this panel, I'll yield myself time for one question for Mr. Hassan and Mr. Soltan. It's a yes or no question. I think appropriate way for us to end this. When you were in prison, and for those who were unjustly detained, are messages of support from Americans, from American members of Congress, from the United States senators, do those messages resonate? Do you hear, are you aware of those statements of support?
If I may, hell yes.
Thank you, Mr. Soltan. Mr. Hassan?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Thank you both very much, Mr. Hassan and Mr. Soltan. We're really grateful for your testimony. We're especially grateful that you appeared today to share your stories. And hearing no further questions, we're going to move on. So I will let you, Mr. Hassan, Mr. Soltan, to go. I'll let you go. We appreciate it again. Thank you so much for being with us. Next, I will deliver a brief opening statement followed by Ranking Member Wilson, and then our second panel. Let me just start by thanking the witnesses on our second panel for being so patient as we heard the, I think, important and powerful testimony from our witnesses on our first panel. The rest of our hearing today will examine current trends in politics, economics, and human rights in Egypt. Like all nations, Egypt faces significant political, health, and economic challenges as a result of COVID-19. The health ministry estimates that infections will soon reach 100,000 nationwide. Tourism, which accounts for as much as 15% of GDP, has plummeted. Slowing trade is undercutting revenue from the Suez Canal, and plummeting global energy prices hurt the Egyptian oil and gas sector, which was a significant source of growth before the pandemic. Domestically, President Sisi remains in firm control of Egypt's political system, and an insurgency in the Sinai involving an affiliate of Islamic State continues to disrupt Egypt's and threaten Egypt's security. Regionally, a dispute with Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam remains unresolved, and Egypt's also impacted by growing tensions involving Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean and the escalating war in neighboring Libya. Since the 1978 Camp David Accords, Egypt's been an important security partner of the United States. Egypt has maintained its peace treaty with Israel and cooperated with the U.S. on counterterrorism. The Suez Canal is vital to the free flow of global trade and the prosperity of Europe, Africa, and Asia, and a strong U.S.-Egypt relationship is clearly in our national interest. So too, however, is protection of human rights, pluralism, and due process in Egypt. The continued rejection on too many occasions of those ideals is troubling and clashes with U.S. values, but it also affects U.S. interests. We continue to see suppression of human rights activists and attacks on journalists, persecution of the LGBT community, disturbing levels of gender-based violence and sexual harassment, and abuses against the Coptic Christians and other religious minorities. And the persecution of political opponents fosters instability with negative repercussions for Egypt and the broader Middle East. The politically motivated arrest and unjust detention of American citizens is not acceptable anywhere, ever, but it is particularly troubling when it occurs by a partner nation. I was relieved that Egypt released U.S. citizens Mohamed Amasha and Reem Dasuki earlier this year, but the continued arbitrary detention and imprisonment of individuals, whether American or Egyptian, is unacceptable. Amasha was detained for 486 days, Dasuki for 301 days before their release, which followed the tragic death of U.S. citizen Mustafa Qasim in January. He died after a hunger strike to protest the imprisonment and inhumane detention conditions after being sentenced in 2018 to 15 years in prison in a mass trial. During our first panel today, we heard from two people who faced imprisonment, harassment, and intimidation by the Egyptian government. And their stories provided members of this subcommittee an important opportunity to see the personal costs of Egypt's human rights crackdown. In each hearing on Egypt that we have held since the uprising that overthrew Mubarak, I have said that we must be clear about our commitment to human rights, regardless of who's in power in Egypt. The Egyptian government must take action to conform to human rights standards we expect from U.S. partners and allies. And while we appreciate the State Department's efforts to secure the release of several American citizens from Egypt, the U.S. must utilize all the tools at our disposal to ensure that Egypt meets human rights standards and brings an end to arbitrary detention of political opponents and activists, as well as the growing suppression of independent media, NGOs, and other elements of civil society. So I look forward to learning more about trends in Egypt's politics, economics, and human rights from our witnesses today, hear their suggestions on how we can put the U.S.-Egypt relationship on sounder footing, which will benefit Americans and Egyptians, as well as the wider region. And with that, I'll recognize Ranking Member Wilson for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ted Deutsch. And I'm actually, amazingly enough, going to echo much of what you just said. And hey, I actually miss not seeing you, or this is incredible. So good to be with you today. Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for calling today's important hearing on developments in Egypt. I believe the ties that bind the United States and Egypt are vital for the security of the United States and the Middle East, as well as the stability of the Middle East and North Africa as a whole. Like our friendships with other partners around the world, the relationship between Washington and Cairo is not perfect, but I believe that both sides do sincerely want to deepen the relationship and that we both benefit from closer ties between our two countries. I am so grateful for the positive relationship we have fostered with Cairo, especially in the military-to-military front. One of my own sons, Julian, served in Egypt on a peacekeeping tour as a captain in the South Carolina Army National Guard with Bright Star. Egypt's key role in the Arab world, as well as the regional location, located next to chaotic Libya on the west and threatened by militants roaming the Sinai Peninsula on the east, underscore the importance of a strong U.S. support to the Egyptian military. Simply stated, it is in our national interest that we foster strong military ties between our two countries because we see the return in investment over the years. At the same time, as Chairman Deutsch has mentioned, that doesn't mean we do not have concerns regarding other areas of Egyptian policy. I am deeply concerned by the human rights record in Egypt, especially after reading the 2019 State Department Human Rights Report, which details significant human rights abuses by the Egyptian government. These included arbitrary killings, torture, forced disappearances, and a wide-scale assault on basic human rights like freedom of assembly and freedom of press. The assault on human rights has even targeted American citizens. I was saddened and angered by reports earlier this year of the death of the American citizen Mustafa Qassam, who died of a heart failure in an Egyptian prison after a hunger strike. I support Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in his call for the Egyptian government to stop unwarranted harassment of U.S. citizens and their families. But we shouldn't stop there. The U.S. should vociferously encourage Egypt to improve on human rights. I believe that the deterioration of human rights in Egypt is one of the most dangerous threats to the Egyptian prosperity. At the same time, I disagree with the approach of linking human rights to military ties. We should not cut off our nose to spite our face. Close ties with Cairo mean more leverage and opportunities to effect positive change on critical issues like human rights. Punishing Egypt for its human rights record by weakening defense ties is misguided. It threatens the regional U.S. security interest while also doing absolutely nothing on the human rights front, saving and throwing Egypt into the hands of other despotic powers who are more willing to look the other way. Furthermore, Egypt must also do more to stop Iranian ships from passing through the Suez Canal in violation of Iran sanctions. I was disappointed in President Sisi's comments that the U.S. sanctions on Iran, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, were destabilizing. I'm also appalled by Egypt's opposition to the Arab League's labeling Hezbollah as a terrorist organization in 2016. Still, I believe there is no substitute for strong U.S.-Egyptian ties that ultimately benefit both the people of Egypt and America. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we in Congress can help thread the needle to a positive direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back for the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Wilson. I'll now introduce our second panel of distinguished witnesses and thank them again for their patience. Dr. Michele Dunne is the Director and Senior Fellow in Carnegie's Middle East Program, where her research focuses on political and economic change in Arab countries, particularly Egypt, and U.S. policy in the Middle East. Dr. Dunne was a Middle East specialist at the U.S. Department of State from 1986 to 2003 and holds a Ph.D. from Georgetown University. Ms. Amy Hawthorne is the Deputy Director of Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy. Prior to joining APAMED in October 2015, Amy served as Resident Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East, was an appointee at the U.S. Department of State for 2 years, and served as a founding executive director of the Hollings Center for International Dialogue, a non-governmental organization that promotes mutual understanding between the United States and predominantly Muslim countries. Dr. Tamara Wittes is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, where she focuses on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Dr. Wittes served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November 2009 to January 2012. Prior to joining Brookings, she served as a Middle East specialist at the U.S. Institute of Peace, as Director of Programs of the Middle East Institute in Washington, and she's taught courses in international relations and security studies at Georgetown University. And Samuel Tadros is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom, where he researches Middle Eastern politics, Islamist movements, and religious freedom. He is also the co-host of Sam and Amar at Al Hurra TV, a program dedicated to covering Middle Eastern political and social developments from a classical liberal perspective. I now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Dr. Dunne, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson, for the honor of testifying before the subcommittee. Let me start by saying I share the concerns about abysmal human rights conditions that were articulated by Mr. Hassan and Mr. Soltan, both of whom are courageous and committed rights defenders. But my testimony is going to focus on the political and economic situation. So I have 3 points to make and 2 recommendations. Point number 1, the Egyptian people are facing intense challenges. There is a population of 102 million that is growing rapidly. There is deep and increasing poverty. Fully a third of Egyptians live on less than $1.50 a day, a percentage that has been growing year by year. And there is high youth unemployment. There's a looming Nile water shortage due to wasteful consumption and increasing use by upstream countries, including Ethiopia. And there's diminishing arable land due to climate change, raising the specter of food insecurity. Second point, under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the military dominates governance as never before and has become increasingly rapacious. Civilian institutions such as the judiciary, legislature, central auditing authority, and diplomatic corps have been stripped of independence. Military officers with veto power now sit alongside senior civilians, such as ministers and provincial governors, an arrangement that was recently enshrined in law. Elections take place, but they're meaningless, and few citizens even bother to vote. In the economy, the military controls government contracting, and military-owned companies crowd out privately owned companies in selected sectors. Just this week, privately owned cement companies are collapsing after a military company flooded the market. Now, in addition to distorting the economy, Sisi's regime is diverting scarce resources away from the critical needs of the Egyptian people and towards arms purchases and vanity mega projects. One major pet project for President Sisi has been building a new administrative capital in the desert 30 miles east of Cairo, which is completely unneeded and frankly disastrous from a water and environment point of view. And the total cost of this project is estimated to be at least $58 billion, and at least $9 billion have been spent on it in the last few years. Meanwhile, Sisi has gone on an incredible arms spending spree, making Egypt the world's third largest importer of weapons over the past 5 years. Since 2015, Sisi has spent more than $12 billion on arms purchases from Russia, France, and Germany, most recently the $2 billion on Russian Su-35 fighters, which will trigger sanctions from the United States under CAATSA once delivery takes place, which appears to be imminent. And meanwhile, there's a new $10 billion arms deal with Italy proposed. All of this is on top of the $1.3 billion that Egypt is receiving from the United States annually. With all these arms purchases, one might be forgiven for thinking that Egypt was a rich country or one at war. But while Egypt has some security challenges, they do not justify this arms buying spree. And Egypt is far from rich. In fact, for nearly a decade now, it has needed more than $10 billion annually in external financing just to keep the government afloat. Egypt has borrowed extensively, including $20 billion from the IMF alone since 2016, $8 billion of that just this year. And it will certainly go back to the IMF for more next year. Oddly enough, one hears nothing from the IMF about the military distortion of the economy or about Sisi's reckless spending on arms and on mega projects. My third point is that the United States has become complicit in this dangerous mismatch between the needs of the Egyptian people and Sisi's priorities, wittingly or not. The Congress has been appropriating assistance for Egypt, $1.3 billion in foreign military financing, varying amounts of economic support funds for 4 decades now, based on the understanding that the Egyptian military would be a force for peace in the region and stability at home. But unfortunately, U.S. assistance is now understood by Egyptians as supporting brutal and abusive military rule. To conclude, I have 2 recommendations, and they are specific to the economic situation. Recommendation 1, Congress should lead a rebalancing of U.S. assistance to Egypt, diminishing FMF, and instead making a meaningful investment in helping the Egyptian people. For example, aiding the desperately needed revolution in water usage and agriculture, as well as continuing to support human development through higher education. Recommendation 2, leaders in Congress should press the U.S. administration to engage with the IMF to support firm conditionality for any further IMF lending to Egypt. For example, reforms that roll back military privileges in the economy to allow the private sector to flourish and create jobs, as well as strong transparency and anti-corruption conditions. I thank you for this time, and I'll be delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dunne. Ms. Hawthorne, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for convening this hearing and inviting me to testify. I apologize in advance if you have trouble hearing me. I had some technical problems on my end this morning. I will address Egypt's alarming repression and human rights fiasco, why this matters to the United States, and how we should respond. 7 years ago, then Defense Minister, now President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, led the armed forces removal of unpopular but freely elected President Mohamed Morsi, promising civilian rule and a democratic transition. Instead, el-Sisi violently crushed opposition and built a military-backed dictatorship, the most repressive in Egypt's modern history. Today, the country has become, for many Egyptians, a dark and terrifying place. The regime says an iron grip is needed to combat terrorism, but the crackdown far exceeds any legitimate security response. And the regime uses fighting terrorism as a cover for repression. Assisi's laws deny fundamental freedoms. They enable a growing list of peaceful activities to be deemed terrorism, subject to draconian punishments. Institutions like the judiciary and parliament have been purged of all but regime supporters. Independent civic activity is not tolerated. Assisi governs with apparent disdain for civilians, as he increasingly empowers military colleagues to run the state and the economy, as Dr. Dunne described. The human rights crisis under Assisi is dramatically worse than Mubarak's in scale, scope, and viciousness. First, scale. Several tens of thousands of Egyptians have been arrested on political grounds. Untold thousands are kept in a horrifying network of jails, prisons, and secret, even underground, detention centers. Second, the wide scope of those affected. Caught up in the dragnet are not only Islamists, they are also secular politicians, youth activists, human rights defenders, women's rights advocates, children, journalists, LGBTQ Egyptians, Christian teenagers, and Coptic rights activists, novelists and singers, senior military figures, and civilian residents of the war-torn northern Sinai Peninsula. Among the many people who have been unjustly locked up include American citizens. And as mentioned, in January, one of them, Mustafa Qasim, died in prison. Third is the viciousness of this regime's tactics, which include arrests of family members, forced disappearances, essentially state kidnapping, extrajudicial killings, sham trials, mass death sentences, and widespread torture and other abuse. Recently, challenged by the coronavirus and a sinking economy, the regime has ratcheted up repression even further. Doctors have been imprisoned for criticizing the government's pandemic response. Outrageously, the regime is retaliating against witnesses who bravely came forward to testify about a gang rape. Several witnesses, including an American citizen, were detained for morality crimes, and some were subject to intrusive sexual exams. The United States has important strategic interests in Egypt, but they do not justify looking away from this human rights disaster. Not only is the situation morally abhorrent, it has directly harmed American citizens. What's more, Assisi's repression threatens Egypt's very stability. As we've seen before in this region, the combination of harsh authoritarian rule, deteriorating economy, and a large disaffected youth population can be highly combustible. Obviously, the United States cannot turn Egypt into a democracy that fully respects the rights of its citizens. Our influence is limited. Egypt's future lies mainly in the hands of Egyptians, but we cannot conduct business as usual. At a minimum, some red lines must be drawn. Among them, first, the United States should consistently speak out about human rights violations. Second, Assisi should not be invited to visit Washington while his regime is carrying out horrific abuses. Third, Congress should reduce military aid, condition a portion of the remaining funds on human rights improvements with no national security waiver. At the same time, we should do whatever we can to support those Egyptians who, against all odds, are bravely speaking out about human rights and fighting for justice and basic dignity. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hawthorne, and thanks for working through those technical challenges that we heard you just fine. Dr. Wittes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch. Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. I so appreciate your convening this hearing and inviting me to appear before you today, along with my respected colleagues. I must emphasize, as always, that I only represent myself before you. The Brookings Institution does not take institutional positions on policy issues. In my years working on U.S.-Egyptian relations, I have never seen the relationship as unbalanced and ineffective for American interests as it is today. Over the last decade, and especially in the current administration, American policy toward Egypt has moved from a comprehensive mutual partnership into one that is almost exclusively defined by our military assistance and our military-to-military relationship. Consider the trend in US assistance to Egypt over the last 3 decades. In fiscal year 1990, the ratio of American military assistance to economic assistance provided to Egypt was just over 1-to-1. In fiscal year 2018, that ratio of military to economic aid was well over 4-to-1. Dr. Dunne has described to you the many ways in which the Egyptian military has steadily taken over control of politics, economics, and the media. The trajectory of our support to Egypt appears to bolster and reward this military takeover of state and society. I don't believe that this is the intention of American policy, but it is the result. So it is long past time to restructure how we approach this partnership. The historical US-Egyptian partnership was rooted in shared strategic and security goals for the region, including advancing Arab-Israeli peace, resisting Soviet influence, and combating Islamist terrorism. But President Sisi is not inclined to or capable of that kind of partnership. His fixation on regime security and fighting a regional struggle for power has made him a stingy and unreliable partner, uninterested in cooperation to stabilize a region in turmoil. To the contrary, his coercive approaches, both domestically and abroad, are exacerbating instability and security problems, not just for the region, but for Europe and the United States. Sisi's sponsorship of Khalifa Haftar's war against the internationally recognized government of Libya has prolonged and exacerbated the Libyan civil conflict. It's given greater space to Islamist terrorist groups in the Maghreb. It's displaced thousands of people, and it's bolstered the numbers of refugees and migrants who are trying to flee to Europe. Much of Sisi's counterinsurgency campaign in the Sinai has involved scorched earth tactics, including bulldozing villages, displacing residents, an approach that one Israeli analyst described to me as good at making the sand jump. More broadly, Sisi's intense repression and the large numbers of political prisoners raise real concerns about whether the Egyptian government's approach is cultivating extremism more than it is combating it. Sisi's Egypt maintains diplomatic relations and open communications with the Assad regime in Damascus, as well as with Tehran. He's made major military purchases from Russia, maintains some trade with North Korea, welcomes Chinese investment in Egypt, continues discrimination against the Coptic community, and detains American citizens and their family members. And as you have heard at length today, President Sisi has escalated his repression and his persecution of civil society and human rights activists. In the face of these concerns, Congress has placed increasingly strict conditions on a portion of US military assistance to Cairo. And I think this conditionality has had some impact in delivering Egyptian responses to specific US concerns, like the case against American NGO workers, or some aspects of the Egyptian-North Korean relationship. But too often, the executive branch waives the conditions imposed by Congress. I think these efforts show that focused, sustained pressure with clear demands can have some limited impact on Egyptian actions. I agree with my colleagues that this conditionality should be renewed and the national security waivers should be removed to ensure congressional will is enforced. We should also press for much closer American monitoring of the end uses to which the weapons we provide Egypt are put. The United States can work constructively with Egypt's government on mutual interests in a focused, conditioned manner. But American officials must not be blind to the nature of the regime or this partnership. And they must guard against the United States becoming further implicated in Sisi's repression and regional adventurism. At the same time, I think we can and should use economic and other civilian assistance to help the Egyptian people confront challenges already on their doorstep, especially water scarcity. And I believe it is in American interest to see the people of Egypt realize their aspirations for security, for dignity, and for freedom. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wittes. And next we'll go to Mr. Tadros. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak at today's hearing. Chairman Engel's invitation for today's hearing highlighted that while Egypt remained an important partner to the United States, the relationship between both countries has become more complicated in recent years. It further explained the purpose of this hearing as examining the political, economic, and human rights dynamics in Egypt. The two statements are closely linked. Despite the US-Egyptian alliance being a cornerstone of the American-led order in the Middle East since the late 1970s, the previous decade has witnessed unprecedented tensions between both countries, leading many to question the value of the alliance. At their core, these tensions are the result of clear miscalculations and misunderstandings by both parties from the very beginning. From the US side was a miscalculation of Egypt's role in the Middle East, which Washington hoped could lead the region to peace just as it had led it to war. This was in contrast to the reality of Egypt's diminishing ability to play a role in the Middle East and its lack of desire to do so. The US was betting on an Egypt that no longer existed. From the Egyptian side, the alliance was understood as solely based on foreign policy and did not include domestic affairs. Egypt believed that it had already paid its entry price for the alliance through accepting to sign a separate peace agreement with Israel, and never accepted the idea that further requests would be placed by the United States regarding the Egyptian regime's domestic policies, from issues of democratization to human rights. The result of these misunderstandings has been constant tensions, leading many in Washington to question the value of the relationship. Similarly, it has led Cairo to conclude that the United States is not a reliable ally and to hedge its bets elsewhere. There is no greater indictment of the US policy towards Egypt than the fact that despite billions of dollars spent, at the moment of truth, there was no constituency in Egypt willing to defend the bilateral relationship and alliance. Despite the relationship improving under President Trump, this has not been the result of a solution to the existing misunderstandings and disagreements, but instead they have been the result of the Trump administration bypassing those questions while adjusting the Obama administration's policies regarding the Muslim Brotherhood. While Egypt has welcomed these changes, it has failed to address any of Washington's concerns. Egypt's continued and deepening ties with Russia illustrate that it still views the relationship as unreliable. This makes any existing improvement only temporarily and delays the inevitable reckoning with the relationship's inherent misunderstandings. Instead, a clear reassessment of the relationship that is based on Egypt's actual conditions is necessary. A reassessment that views Egypt not as a contestant in the regional power struggle, but as the ultimate prize in that contest, that acknowledges the potential for state collapse in Egypt and the dire ramifications of such an outcome, which should be prevented. In engaging Egypt and attempting to change the regime's behavior, the United States should take note of two facts: the deep animosity and suspicion that the regime, as well as the population at large, has of the United States, and the limited leverage the US has on Cairo. While the military aid is still significant, no change in aid policy will change Cairo's behavior on matters that the regime views as pertaining to its survival. Nonetheless, the alliance and military aid does bring the United States some leverage that can be utilized in areas where the regime's survival is not at stake. The Egyptian regime will not collapse if it releases people like Coptic activist Rami Kamel, economist Omar al-Shiniti, and former member of parliament Ziad al-Alimi. The regime's survival is not at stake if it enforces the rule of law and attacks on Copts instead of resorting to reconciliation sessions as House Resolution 49 asks, or if it addresses rampant anti-Americanism by its controlled media or stops arresting Americans. Thank you again for holding this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tadros. Thanks to all of the witnesses for your excellent testimony. I'll now recognize the members for 5 minutes each. Pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. And because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. And if you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I'll now call on members for questioning, and insofar as the ranking member has another commitment, a hard stop coming up soon, I will defer until the end, and I yield 5 minutes to Ranking Member Wilson.
And thank you very much for your thoughtfulness. And Mr. Tadros, while I appreciate our close ties with Cairo, I'm concerned about Egypt's weak stance vis-a-vis Iran. Why has President Sisi consistently voiced opposition to sanctions on Iran? Why has Egypt let Iranian ships traverse the Suez Canal? Why did the Egyptian government oppose the Arab League's labeling of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization in 2016?
I think the perception of the Iranian threat in Cairo is very different from that of the countries of the Gulf or in the Levant, where the relationship, the tensions between the Sunni and Shia communities plays an important role in how these regimes perceive the Iranian threat, as well as Iranian attempts at subversion in these countries. From Cairo, which is far away from Iran, the perception of Iran is a faraway issue that does not impact it directly. Hence, while Egypt has had its own tensions with Iran regarding the relations in the past, support by Iran for various activities in Egypt that results in the lack of diplomatic relationship between both countries, this has also meant that Cairo has taken a softer position on issues pertaining to Iran than, say, compared to other Gulf countries.
To me, it's sad that they don't see the connection of Iran to Hamas and the Hamas threat to Egypt. But thank you for your insight. And Dr. Cofman Wittes, Egyptian President Sisi has praised the recent normalization, the peace treaty between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. What is your position on the peace deal?
Thank you, Congressman Wilson. I think we can only see the opening of a formal relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates as a good thing. And it is bringing out into the open a relationship that has existed quietly and behind the scenes for a number of years. I expect also that Egypt sees the Emiratis' choice to go forward on their own without waiting for the Arab Peace Initiative as a validation of Egypt's own choice in making its separate peace with Israel in the Camp David Accords. And indeed, a lot of the commentary in the Egyptian media has made exactly that connection.
Well, thank you very much for that insight. And this is going to be a challenge because it's for three of you, for Dr. Dunne, Ms. Hawthorne, and Dr. Coleman Wittes. In a June 30, 2019 letter to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the Egypt Working Group, which you all signed, called to renew international attention for various international Egyptian detainees, including, quote, Hoda Abdel Manim, I hope I pronounced it correctly, a prominent female human rights attorney, end of quote. Hoda Abdel Manim is not, in fact, a prominent female human rights attorney. She is a senior member in the Muslim Brotherhood's Women's Division. There is plenty of information provided publicly to demonstrate her Muslim Brotherhood affiliation, including on Muslim Brotherhood websites. In 2006 article, she wrote that a woman was obligated to follow her husband if he called her to bed and defended a husband's right to beat his wife if she didn't follow him. In your view, can a senior figure of the Muslim Brotherhood, which espouses a distinctly bigoted ideology and incites against Egyptian Christians be considered a human rights defender? And do you believe that the United States government should advocate for Muslim Brotherhood's freedom, given the organization's well-established bigotry, misogyny, and incitement to violence?
I can address that question. Thank you, Representative Wilson. So I think what I would say, and I won't speak on behalf of the other witnesses, is that the working group on Egypt has advocated for observation of universal human rights standards in Egypt against all detainees, and that has included members of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know whether Ms. Abdulmomen is or is not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but although Egypt has classified the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, the United States has not. And I think we believe that there should not be these kind of political arrests and detentions, and often, lack of due process, lengthy detention without charge, torture, etc. So that would be my point of view on it.
Dr. Wittes or Ms. Hawthorne?
Yes, for those of you who can't see me, this is Amy Hawthorne. I agree with Dr. Dunne's
response. The most important thing, in my view, for the United States is to advocate for the rule of law and due process for people who are acting peacefully. They should receive the full due process of law and be treated according to human rights standards, no matter what their personal or political views.
Thank you, Dr. Wittes.
I think my colleagues have covered it well. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Wilson, you're muted.
As I depart, I want to thank the chairman for his leadership. In fact, I even look forward to seeing him next week, and even Jerry Connolly. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Next, we'll go to Mr. Vargas. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? Yes? Well, again, I want to.
Sorry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the ranking member, and I want to thank all of the people who are participating today. I think that many of us probably, and certainly people of my age, I'm 59, remember 1979, the Iranian Revolution. I think that's in the back of most of our minds when we had the Shah of Iran, who we didn't necessarily like too much, but certainly worked with. We saw him deposed by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who then became the supreme leader under this theocratic republic. And I think a lot of us worry about that happening in the largest, the most populous country in the Middle East, as you know, is Egypt, followed by Iran. And so I think that a lot of us are very, although, of course, I don't want to excuse the Persian / Middle East, but I would say that a lot of us fear that, yes, we have a person who does not follow the rule of law as we would like, but someone who maybe is not as bad as the next person that would come along. I think a lot of us fear that. And why shouldn't we be fearful of that? And again, I agree that we have to pursue human rights. I mean, I believe that deeply, but at the same time, I don't think we can be naive as to what potentially could happen if Egypt became a radicalized nation. I mean, what do we do? And I put that out to any of the presenters.
Chairman Judge?
Yes, go ahead.
Please.
Tamara, go ahead.
Thank you. Congressman Vargas, I think the issue you raise is one that has bedeviled American foreign policy for decades in many of our partnerships with autocratic regimes. But the fundamental lesson that I take from that history is that the United States cannot determine the direction of another country's politics, either for better or for worse. To me, the lesson of the Iranian Revolution is that we need to ensure that if we are partnering with a government that does not respect the rights of its people, and we're doing it for reasons of our own national interest, that we are not conveying the message to those people that we condone or accept or support what is happening to them. It is our entanglement with the Shah, the perception of many Iranians that we were the facilitators of the Shah's repression that has earned us a lot of ire in the post-revolutionary period, and frankly, that gave a lot of ammunition to the Islamic Republic's regime. So if we need to work with Egypt in specified ways, as we work with other difficult countries around the world, let us do that, but let us be clear and let us guard ourselves from actively supporting dimensions of their domestic governance that are against our interests. In the Egyptian case specifically, I think what worries me is that the vast number of detainees who are held for political reasons, because they express dissent, or merely because they don't express support for the government, seems to be creating the potential for radicalization inside Egypt's prisons. And this was a problem that was highlighted both by the previous administration and by the current administration. So our worry about Sisi is not just that he's repressive, and not just that he may be creating the seeds for another revolution, but that he may be making the outcome even more radical than it would otherwise be through his abuses.
Mr. Tadros, you said that there's, in the population, there's deep animosity for the United States. I don't want to misquote you. I think that's what you said. How does this jive then together? I mean, if we're not supporting him and then someone else comes in, there's deep animosity towards us. I mean, what should we do?
Thank you, Congressman. The sad reality is that this animosity is partly the result of regime propaganda and a result of various differences and disagreements between the people's perception of the United States and the reality of it. In terms of regime propaganda, President Sisi, as well as other members of his regime, have used the term fourth-generation warfare, a term that they use to describe a conspiracy against Egypt by sinister elements that involves the United States. This has been repeated on numerous times by President Sisi. The regime propaganda machine then repeats this, portraying the United States as an enemy of Egypt that seeks to divide the country. So we've had all sorts of stories spread by the Egyptian media, even portraying magical battles. I mean, according to the Egyptian media, war erupted between the US Sixth Fleet and the Egyptian Navy, in which Egypt defeated the US fleet and captured the commander of the US Sixth Fleet. This is not some crazy stuff being said by some random guy. This is something said by regime members on official regime channels. So there's a concentrated effort that is done by the regime to spread this anti-Americanism. But we also must admit that there are issues where the United States policy has clashed with what Egyptians believe in. If you belong to the non-Islamist camp in Egypt, then you view the Obama administration's policies towards the Muslim Brotherhood, engaging with that organization, as something of animosity towards Egypt. If you are an Islamist, on the other hand, then you view, of course, the United States relationship with President Sisi in the same light. So I think no matter where you belong on the political spectrum in Egypt, people share this suspicion and animosity towards the United States.
Thank you. My time has expired. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to go over a little bit. Thank you, sir.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Answer.
Thanks, Mr. Vargas. I think, Mr. Shabbat, if you're still with us, you are next to be recognized. I am. Oh, there you are. Mr. Shabbat, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tadros, I'll begin with you. It's concerning, the disagreements surrounding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I'd like to ask you about that. While I tend to be sympathetic to the Egyptian side, it's critical, I believe, for the U.S. to remain a neutral, honest broker. With that in mind, can you discuss what an acceptable outcome for Egypt might be regarding the dam and how we might facilitate an arrangement that's acceptable to all sides?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the Egyptian position has evolved over the years as Egypt has realized that its initial positions were completely unrealistic. Initially, Egypt was trying to demand that the Ethiopians would abide by all treaties that were signed at the time of colonial powers controlling the fate of the entire region, and which gave Egypt a majority of the share of the water, an overwhelming majority of that share. As Egypt has come to recognize that Ethiopia has legitimate reasons to seek development, legitimate reasons for electricity production, for its own progress, as Ethiopia is now a growing country with various needs. I think the Egyptian position has shifted, now looking to more amendable issues regarding how water is stored in the dam, the time frame that it takes the water, for example, to fill that dam in order not to impact the flow of water to Egypt. I think Egypt resorting to the United States gave the United States an opportunity to build some much needed goodwill in Cairo, where the Egyptians have recognized that for all the talk about China and Russia and all of these potential allies or balances to the United States, at the moment of truth, it was only the United States that was willing and capable to help Egypt in such an important national security question for it.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to follow up with additional question relative to the Muslim Brotherhood. I'd like to discuss maybe the relative strength of the Brotherhood in Egypt currently. How strong is it really now, and how many people would you say detained in Egypt for political purposes have a direct or indirect ties to the Muslim Brotherhood?
The size of the Muslim Brotherhood is a secret that only they know. We have rough estimates of roughly about 400,000, 500,000 members. This is prior to the crackdown, of course. What we've seen throughout the past few years is really the complete elimination of the Muslim Brotherhood as a serious force in Egypt. This has taken place both by regime tactics, arrests of Muslim Brotherhood members, the escape of various other members to Turkey, to Qatar. There are significant groups of the Brotherhood that operate from these countries and still incite against Egypt from there and call for violence, but also through popular rejection. The Muslim Brotherhood's 1 year in power antagonized a large share of the Egyptian population and has resulted in this gulf between the Muslim Brotherhood and the rest of the population. Currently, we see two competing leadership structures of the Brotherhood, splinter groups that, for example, like Hasm or Liwa al-Thawra, that clearly conduct terrorist operations and are recognized as such, but a disarray in the leadership structure of the Brotherhood, given that most of the senior leadership is either in prison, is killed, or escaping in Turkey and can't lead the group on the ground.
Thank you. And then finally, there are reports that Egypt is in the process of acquiring Russian Su-35 jets. If true, this would obviously be concerning. So I'd like to ask about how Russia seeks to cultivate Egypt as a partner. And can you talk about how best to counter Russia in Egypt and about the importance of U.S. arms sales to Egypt as a counterweight to what Russia's up to?
Russia, I think, has a multi-layered strategy working in the Middle East that involves both hard power issues, support for the Syrian dictator, selling weapons, support for Libyan mercenaries, things like that, but also involves a lot of soft power mechanisms, from portraying Putin as the protector of Christians in the Middle East, a message that has special echoes in countries like Egypt and Syria, from cultural outreach. The Russian Cultural Center in Cairo always offers these cheap courses for people to learn Russian, attempting to build relations. But there are also realities of facts on the ground that help Russia in that regard. No matter who rules Egypt, Russia is an important partner simply by virtue of the fact that 3 million Russians used to visit Egypt as tourists. And this represented about 20% of the size of the Egyptian tourism industry, which is one of the main sources of the foreign currency and the basis of the Egyptian economy. So there are issues that mean that Russia will continue to be involved in Egypt no matter what. From the Egyptian side, of course, there is admiration for President Putin. There's a feeling that he, or an idea that the model that he offers might be applicable in a place like Egypt, as well as hedging bets on Russia, on balancing, playing the two superpowers, if we can even describe Russia as such, against each other, similar to what the former Egyptian ruler, President Nasser, did during the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. And I'll yield to myself for questions. And I want to follow up on Mr. Shabbat's excellent line of questioning about Russia. And Dr. Wittes, let me just ask you if, just to follow up on where Congressman Shabbat left off, and Mr. Tadros spoke about what Russia is hoping to do here. The question, the ultimate question is Russia able to replace the United States as the preferred security partner of Egypt? And if, as Congressman Shabbat referred to, the possible Egyptian purchase of advanced Russian fighter aircraft, with that deal, what would that mean for longstanding U.S.-Egyptian military relations?
Chairman Deutsch, thank you. I think that's a very important question to pursue. The first thing I would say is that the success of the longstanding U.S. military aid program to Egypt, which was begun in part to help shift Egypt away from a previous dependence on Soviet military equipment, we've had significant success in large chunks of the Egyptian military in transforming their force to American equipment, American supplies, American maintenance and training contracts. And that includes, I believe, the majority of their fixed-wing attack aircraft. So this purchase from the Russians, if in fact it is delivered, would begin a process of diversifying their air attack capability. But it would take them a long time, I think, to reverse the trend that's been ongoing for all these decades. They also have quite a lot invested themselves in the military relationship with the United States, including joint production of M1A1 Abrams tanks in Egypt, using kits that we supply through the military aid program. And that is part of that military industrial complex that Dr. Dunne was describing. And of course, they also have a lot at stake in ongoing military cooperation with the United States in counterterrorism, in exercises like Bright Star. So I don't think that they would take lightly this kind of decision. My assessment of Russian intentions, not only in Egypt, but in the Middle East more broadly, is that they are more opportunistic. They're more interested in interfering with our relationships than they are in trying to establish any new sort of presence in the region, certainly not any hegemonic presence, which frankly I doubt they have the capability to achieve. There is another dimension of the Egyptian-Russian relationship that's worth mentioning, which is not military. It's not only tourism, but Egypt buys a lot of wheat. I think most of the wheat it buys from Russia. And so if the United States wants to balance Russian engagement, one of the things we can do is help them with the water scarcity, with their agricultural production, and make them less dependent on Russian food imports.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wittes. Let me actually raise a topic that's not come up in all of the time we've spent together talking about Egypt, and that's China. Egypt was one of the first countries to join China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Bilateral trade surpassed $13.8 billion in 2018. There are the major projects, the industrial zone in the Gulf of Suez region, the Chinese investment in Egypt's new administrative capital that we talked briefly about before. So the question, Dr. Dunne, I'll direct this to you, I think, should we expect closer Egyptian-Chinese security and political relations to follow these developing trade and economic ties? And how should the United States approach Cairo's embrace of the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese investment in Egypt?
Thank you, Representative Deutsch. Yes, Egypt is courting economic ties with China avidly. And I think Egypt is increasingly important to China's strategy in the region. By the way, what I wanted to say more broadly is that I think that Egypt does not want to make choices between the United States and these other partners. What President Sisi is trying to have is all of the above. Have a growing military relationship with Russia, a growing, as well as with France and Germany and Italy, and a growing economic relationship with China, as well as keeping the relationship with the United States and continuing to collect U.S. assistance right on schedule. He's trying to do all of these things at once, and he sees that as diversifying not only the capital and so forth that he can draw into the country, but political support for him around the world. He sees these ties as critical to support for him as the leader of Egypt. So, yes, what can the United States do? Well, right now, China is mostly useful to Egypt economically, and the United States has really declined as an economic partner. So we could be doing more on the economic side. And will China eventually become a security partner? Of course, we've seen that progression in other parts of the world, in other parts of Africa. I think it's, I don't think the Chinese are eager to take on a country with a population as large and as poor as Egypt as a burden. I think they're a little bit leery of doing that at this point. But certainly, I would think in the future, and especially because of the Suez Canal and the strategic position of Egypt, that the Chinese will be looking eventually to play a larger role and maybe even to strong-arm Egypt a bit, as they have done in other countries.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Dunne. And Representative Green, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me start by thanking you and the ranking member for having this second panel and the rest of the meeting today. And I also want to thank the witnesses who have graciously given of their time. I especially want to agree with one of the witnesses' earlier comments about Russia and their intentions. It's pretty clear Putin just gets some credit back home for both disrupting American intentions and interests, as well as giving the perception that Russia still has the ability to project power globally. So I agree 100%. They're not hegemonic in that region. I also want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up the Belt and Road Initiative. I disagree with the witness. I think Egypt is a critical strategic near-term objective of the Belt and Road, and I think your questions were spot on. It appears to me, as I look at the Middle East in general, there is this bipolar axis that has formed between, the Iranian axis, so to speak, and then I don't want to say Shia-Sunni axis, but, Egypt, Jordan, Israel included in that now, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. And my question centers around Egypt's participation with those countries in that. Mr. Tadros, if you could comment on that, and then also about the delta between last year's economic factors that were really good for Egypt and this year's economic factors, particularly as it relates to COVID. So if you could comment on that, sir, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I think there are more than one. There's more than one battle going on in the region, and that's one of the reasons why U.S. policy finds such a complicated scene to play with. True, there is an Iranian versus Sunni powers axis or power struggle in the region that we see in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Bahrain, and other countries. But there's also an intra-Sunni divide between those regimes and groups that, or the regimes that support the Muslim Brotherhood and those that see the Muslim Brotherhood and such Islamist groups as a clear threat to their survival and to their way of life. So we see an alignment between Qatar, Turkey, and the Muslim Brotherhood against Egypt and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in that regard as a junior partner. We see it in cutting the relations with Qatar. We see it in the battle going on in Libya. We see it in various scenes all around the region. And that is one of the reasons why US policy struggles to deal with the fact that Turkey is an ally, Egypt is an ally, and they're on competing ends on Libya, for example, or in the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean that also involves NATO member Greece. Regarding Egypt's response to COVID, I think Egypt has basically realized or chosen the reality that it cannot close the country. We did not have a complete lockdown in Egypt. We just had a few hours curfew as if COVID would sleep at night or something, would sleep in the morning and only operate at night. And hence the economy has not been impacted as other economies all around the world. True, tourism has been deeply affected by this, so foreign currency reserves is an issue. Also, passage through the Suez Canal has declined as the world economy, world trade has declined. But relatively speaking, I think the Egyptian economy has performed much better than other countries which chose to have a complete lockdown.
If I could, I only have a minute left. I wanted to ask you about the impact on Egypt of this recent brokered peace agreement between the UAE and Egypt. I saw today that the president was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Just get your thoughts on what the impact is on Egypt. I know Egypt, the history with Israel is much, much longer. If you could comment on the impact of this new agreement in the Middle East as it relates to Egypt.
I think historically, while Egypt has had official relations with Israel and a peace treaty, it has not welcomed other countries in the region developing close ties with Israel. Egypt's foreign minister for a long time, Amr Moussa, under the Mubarak regime, used to criticize those countries as running towards Israel. Egypt wanted, in a sense, to be the manager of the Arab relationship with the Israelis. This, I think, has changed with President Sisi, who has been willing to take a junior seat to the UAE in the relationship with Israel. And in that sense, he views the UAE's relationship with Israel, which he has publicly welcomed, as something positive, as in a sense that Egypt is now not alone with Jordan in having those official ties, but that others are follows. And this releases, in a sense, part of the pressure that Islamists and Arab nationalists do by using this idea of a relationship with Israel as a means to attack the regime and accuse it of being treacherous to the Arab cause.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. Again, welcome. It's really great to have you on the committee. Seeing no other members who wish to ask questions, before we go, I just wanted to touch on one issue that we haven't had a chance to touch on. Ms. Hawthorne, I'll direct this to you, if I may. Gender-based violence continues to see victims and witnesses in Egypt prosecuted with arbitrary and vague charges, and persecuted charges of indecency, leveled at victims. Civil society groups, support groups are silenced. The Egyptian government has claimed that it's taking sexual assault and harassment seriously, but efforts to go after victims as well as the LGBT community show otherwise, suggest otherwise anyway. And so what additional legal mechanisms could Egypt put in place to protect women from sexual harassment and gender-based violence and to support and protect the LGBT community?
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch. Some very important issues there with regard to
the status of women, women's rights, and LGBT. Both of these issues require a strengthening of the legal framework in Egypt, and perhaps equally as important, a strengthening of the implementation of laws. We need to see the Egyptian government, for example, improve protections for witnesses in sexual violence cases or victims of sexual violence, protecting them when they bravely step forward to report or testify in cases. There could be some legal measures that can help protect their status. It's also very important that women's rights organizations, civil society, need to be able to operate freely and to be able to document and raise cases of issues of attacks and violence and harassment against women. Right now, as you're aware, the Sisi regime is repressing most civil society organizations, including women's rights organizations. So this is critical. On the LGBTQ issue, there are also legal steps that Egypt could take to enshrine rights and protection for this community in the law. And I would note that in the Arab world itself, we have an example of Tunisia, the only genuinely democratizing Arab country, which has actually made progress on this issue in recent years. There are many, many things that can be done to hold accountable security officers who attack and repress LGBTQ youth and other members of the community in Egypt. There is basically impunity for harassment and attacks on that community in Egypt today. And I would just add, in closing, that even though President Sisi sometimes presents himself as a champion of reform and women's rights, when we look at the actual practices of his regime, we see not only repressive measures that are deeply concerning, but a patriarchal and very conservative attitude toward women and other communities that shockingly, in some respects, echoes the discourse and the ideology of, in fact, his nemesis, the Muslim Brotherhood. So the idea that President Sisi is some sort of enlightened modernizer on social issues is simply incorrect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our witnesses and the members who participated in this thorough, I think, important and really interesting and helpful virtual hearing. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon, hopefully in person. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.